And welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm George Spencer. Right now we are following a couple of major cases across the country. If you've been with us today, you know that we were live earlier today in the death penalty phase against admitted murderer Scott Nelson. Nelson was found guilty last week for causing the death of beloved nanny Jennifer Fulford. Nelson has so far had a hard time keeping his composure at the defense table in the courtroom there. He had his second outburst in court today, not including his shocking testimony in which he took the stand in his own defense during this trial. The guilt phase of that trial now complete. A jury has found him guilty. They are now considering whether he will live or die for this crime, and they will be back in the courtroom there on Monday morning at 9 a.m. We'll break down that case for you a little bit later. But right now, the other big case that we're following across the country this afternoon, Alabama prosecutors are planning on announcing in just minutes their decision on whether or not they will prosecute 26-year-old Marsha Jones. Marsha Jones is the Jefferson County woman who was indicted by a grand jury on manslaughter charges after allegedly starting a fight that got her shot in the stomach. It caused her to miscarry the baby that she was carrying at the time. She was 5 months pregnant at the time of that incident. The shooter in all of this, Ebony Jemison, was able to walk away from the shooting outside that Dollar General store. A grand jury chose not to pursue charges against her. But as we said, the big wait this afternoon, we are waiting to see a press conference at any moment now to find out whether the district attorney down there in Jefferson County, Alabama, will be prosecuting this mother-to-be for the fight outside a Dollar General store, a parking lot dispute over apparently a fight with another woman that ended up with Marsha Jones being shot in the stomach. Her baby did not survive. So we are waiting on that big piece of information to come out from Jefferson County prosecutors to find out whether they will follow the recommendation there of the grand jury, which has recommended a manslaughter charge in that case. At this point, we are tracking those developments, which, as we said, should be happening at any moment. And we will let you know just as soon as we find out what the DA down there in Alabama has decided. In the meantime, though, our other big case today, of course, the case out of Orange County, Florida. Scott Nelson, who has been causing all sorts of drama throughout this trial. He has already been found guilty of killing a woman he had never even met before, Jennifer Fulford, in an Orange County murder. It was a heinous crime by his own admission. Let's take a listen to his latest outburst in court, which happened just earlier today. Listen. And if you were watching Law and Crime earlier today, you saw all of that drama playing out in real time there in that Orange County courtroom. You saw Mr. Nelson being escorted out of the courtroom after that outburst. He really lit up as a witness was on the stand saying, really shouting there in the middle of court, "I'm not a racist. This is out of control." It seemed, by what we were able to tell, he was speaking some of this sort of under his breath. It seemed like he was upset by what the witness was saying there on the stand. If memory serves, it was a prison expert who was describing some of Mr. Nelson's time in court. We want to let you hear, though, the judge, who has tried so hard to keep Nelson and really this entire trial right on the rails despite these outbursts. Take a listen to what that Orange County, Florida judge had to say in the minutes after today's outburst occurred. And welcome back. You heard that judge working very hard to keep the defendant in this case, Scott Nelson, the defendant who has already been found guilty by this jury, keep him quiet and keep him subdued during this court as things unfold, as the testimony unfolds now in the penalty phase of this trial. I am being joined now by former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Dmitry Gorin. And Dmitry, I want to ask you the big question today. This is not the first time that we have seen Scott Nelson really acting out in this way there in the courtroom. Are jurors beginning to get tired of this? How do you make sense of what they are feeling as they have watched these outbursts day after day?
You know, for the jurors, they've already convicted him, right? And so now they need to decide on penalty. It doesn't help Mr. Nelson's case that he's doing these outbursts. It shows a lack of control. It probably shows some mental health issues. And so it just will reconfirm to the jury that they did the right thing, that you have an impulsive man on trial. And it certainly is going to make it much tougher for the defendant to avoid the death penalty or avoid the most harshest judgment by this jury. I think they're tired of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, certainly, especially as we've seen it play out again and again there, Dmitry. Let me play a little bit of devil's advocate, though, because I heard you say speaks to mental health issues, possibly. Is any of this going to cause perhaps that one juror there in the courtroom who's watching this to think, you know, this is a guy who is clearly mentally troubled, who is sort of, as his defense has been encouraging us to think, this is a guy who is not able to control his own impulsivity. Is there any sort of backhanded way how these strange outbursts may actually cause one or two of those jurors to think, wow, maybe what the defense is pushing towards here is correct, and this is a man who I'm not comfortable sending really to the ultimate penalty, a death penalty in this case. Do you think that's possible, Dmitry?
I suppose it's possible. I also think jurors are going to say this guy's dangerous. If he can't control himself in a courtroom, how's he going to be on the streets? How's he even going to be in prison? He's somebody that's dangerous. And so, yes, while backhanded in a backhanded manner, you could say maybe he shows mental health issues. But the conduct itself and the crime showed planning, showed some amount of sophistication, showed that he acted logically and rationally. There's nothing about the conduct in the murder case that showed he had mental health problems. So I don't believe these outbursts are really going to help him, because the totality of the circumstances in this case show a cold planning and a horrible murder. Yeah,
and such a sympathetic victim, as you know as well, Dmitry. I mean, in this case, it's just hard not to get wrapped up around the compelling story of Jennifer Fulford herself. We want to take you, though, even a little bit earlier as we await more testimony coming up Monday morning. We want to take you back to one of the earlier outbursts by Scott Nelson in this case, an outburst that occurred actually while his brother was testifying for the defense. Take a listen. Scott Nelson, it seems a man who thinks relatively highly of his own legal skills there. We heard him sort of jumping in on top of his own attorneys, Dmitry, making his own objections in all of this. And as we've seen again and again, the judge trying to keep it all on the rails there. I got to ask, when it happens repeatedly like this, Dmitry, put yourself in the shoes of that judge. How hard is it for the judge to keep everything going, sort of proceeding as it's supposed to there in the courtroom, without letting the jury see him go too far in terms of reprimanding the defendant who's also in there causing these problems? It takes some skill on behalf of the judge, doesn't it?
It does. And it seems like the judge has been very professional, very ethical in the way he's handled this very difficult situation. But there are many other cases that we don't see on TV where you have very difficult defendants and judges deal with them all the time. They try to calm them down. They try to make a good record showing they're bending over backwards to make sure the defendant is getting a fair trial. I've been in situations recently where a client also had an outburst. He actually had an outburst for the right reason. There was an interpretation that was incorrect, and he wanted the judge to know that. And even though my client was correct in the interpretation, the judge still came down on him pretty hard for making any comments. So judges want to control the courtroom, and the courtroom is controlled by the judge and by the attorneys, and they really don't want the defendant to have these outbursts, to interrupt witnesses, etc.
Yeah, in just a moment, we're actually going to hear from Scott Nelson on the stand himself. But Dmitry, I want to ask, how close is this defendant to being removed from the courtroom entirely? That's a very high bar, I should say, and a severe response from a judge. But when we've seen it repeatedly, do you think there's a possibility where if this actually happens again when they return to court on Monday morning, that the judge would say, Mr. Nelson, you're simply not allowed to sit in here if you're going to keep acting up?
Well, the judge has a number of options. I've had cases where the judges actually gagged the defendant physically, but allowed him to remain in the courtroom or shackled him. I've had cases where defendants have been barred from court, but it is a high requirement, of a hurdle the judge must overcome with the record showing that he's done everything possible to give the defendant his constitutional right to be present, and the defendant keeps violating his orders. And so his next step may be to literally gag him shackle him, have officers stand next to him, or kick him out altogether.
Right.
I've seen all those different scenarios, and it really is going to be up to the judge, up to what he can do to control this defendant. I think the last thing the judge wants to do is kick him out of court, because that's going to give the defendant the right on appeal to argue, wait a minute, my constitutional rights were violated. I get a new trial. The judge wants to avoid that.
Yeah, Dmitry opens all sorts of other doors. There have been times in the courtroom, of course, where Scott Nelson has spoken as he's supposed to, answered questions. We want to take a listen now. The defendant himself on the stand in his own defense. And there you have it, the defendant in his own words, Scott Nelson testifying in his own trial down there in Orange County, Florida, calling the victim, who he had never met in that case, quote, collateral damage, likely a big part of the decision to bring Mr. Nelson a guilty verdict in that case, with the trial continuing next week. Meanwhile, we have another big case that we're following right now out of the state of Alabama. Breaking news in the Marsha Jones case. We'll bring that to you when we come back here on Law and Crime. Stay with us.